Hello, good evening, and welcome to Passation TV. I am your host, Hanovi. Recent horrible, devastating, and carnage-filled events in southern Israel, I had to stop and think a little. I had to try to come to terms with what happened, and somehow I decided that I needed to revisit the genesis of this conflict, and maybe, just maybe, I might get a little perspective. First and foremost, I'd like to say it was a horrible event, and the pictures are all over social media. Some, of course, I would prefer not to look at. But in my research, I've come to realize that those events are nothing uncommon to the area. And I've also realized from time immemorial, there have always been some sort of conflict and some sort of cycle of violence, retribution, revenge, and more violence. Unfortunately, this time, I believe that it will be extremely consequential, the events that are taking place. And if you listen to the fighting words of the parties involved, there is absolutely no appetite for negotiation or compromise or peace. As Israel has said, and Benjamin Netanyahu has said, that he intends to reshape the map of the Middle East for generations. And whatever he is planning to do would affect the Middle East for generations. So it's obvious that whatever he's doing will be so impactful if it succeeds that the area will be totally transformed. And if you look at the fighting words of Hamas, their intent is to liberate themselves from what they perceive as an apartheid state. So with those sort of fighting words, it is obvious that none of this is going to end well. And there is also the concern that quite possibly this can unravel and get other parties involved in the conflict, which in itself will be devastating. All the parties involved and their allies are going to rush to support each other, and there will be some sort of demarcation. The United States, a strong supporter of Israel, has already rallied to their side. Because of the brutality of the incident and because of the carnage that resulted, in some respects, supporters of the other side are a little hesitant to rush to provide open support and solidarity. Understandably so. I believe also because of the availability of cameras or phones, the devastation is so much so well documented so that the world sees and can definitely have an impact on people's perception of what is going on over there. So I encourage you to sit back and I will explain to you what I have found about the genesis of this conflict, and we may discuss what is the future prospects for peace or how this will all turn out. I would admit that the prospects for peace currently are looking very dim, but hopefully cool heads will eventually prevail. We have seen close to 900 to 1,000, well, I think the figure is up to like 1,200 Israelis murdered. We're looking at devastating bombardment of Gaza. And of course, as reported, there are also about 1,000 civilians perished in those events. So this is clearly devastating for the world, especially considering that there is a major conflict taking place currently in Ukraine. How those recent events in southern Israel will impact those events in Ukraine and impact the globe as a whole is left to be seen. As it stands, it is very difficult to predict where this is all heading. But we know it is heading in a very bloody direction. And as usual, the people who get caught in the middle are civilians. I would believe that the people who plan the horrible events in southern Israel would definitely have some sort of anticipation of what would have come subsequently. So I also believe it is extremely risky for Israel undertaking a full-scale invasion of Gaza. And quite possibly, there would have been some sort of preparation for that invasion. But as has been seen, the IDF is proficient in many ways. Remember, this is Precision TV. And if you're joining us for the first time, please feel free to subscribe, to share, and comment. You're in for some very fruitful discussion at a time when things are horribly going wrong. Maybe, just maybe, after having this discussion, you may gain some sort of clarity and understanding of where this all started. To understand the genesis of this conflict, you have to understand what was happening in the world around World War I. And pretty much we had the Central Powers going against the Allies. The Central Powers consisted of Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. And the Allies, of course, the usual suspects, France, Britain, Russia. Interestingly enough, yes, Russia was allied with the West during World War I. And of course, the holdings of the British Empire fought on the side of the British. So, as you can see by the map, the yellow areas are the areas designated for Allied support, and the pink looking areas are the areas designated for the Central Powers. As is always the case, whenever there's a war, everybody seeks alliances so that their side would enable to defeat the side of the enemy. You have more allies, you're more likely to win, especially if you have allies who can add to the military effort. And what you see taking place around World War I is just like is the case in individual human interaction, is the same with the interaction between states. And what you see taking place is a case of treachery, double dealing, and downright betrayal, all capped with promises. And you've got to understand that I would say probably 8 out of the 10 conflicts that exist in the world, in some way or the other, can be traced to the British Empire. Whether it was based on the history of Britain itself, how it was able to manipulate its neighbors and created the United Kingdom, I think they learned the lesson well and applied the same model to the rest of the world. And even in a post-independence of these countries, they ensured strategically that things were in place, that eternally it would be nearly impossible for that country to be united in terms of population and politics and economics and militarily sometimes. So let's get back to the Central Powers and the Allies. As I said, Britain and the Allies went about making promises to draw more supporters to their side and draw many more nations to their side. In particular, the Brits, realizing that the Jewish people had a desire for a homeland in Palestine, and there was that clamoring because of the experiences that they had in Europe and the rising anti-Semitism that they experienced in Europe. So a guy named Theodore Herzl, okay, in the 1880s, but officially in like 1896 or so, decided, look, we need to get together and form some orchestrated plan to put in effect the possibility of us getting a homeland in Palestine. So there was the Zionist Congress, and some may be familiar with that. So the Brits said, wanting the support of the Jewish elite, the Brits said, look, if you support us in this World War One, guess what? We would ensure after the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, because at the time, the Ottoman Turks were ruling a large portion of the Middle East, including Palestine, Syria, and Iraq. So the Brits said, look, if you support us and you help fund the war, guess what? We will enable you to get a homeland in Palestine. And it all started off with the Balfour, by Arthur Balfour, the Balfour Declaration, which basically told the world that, hey, this is the intent. So after the Balfour Declaration, I believe that the Jewish people decided that, hey, let's support the Allies, let's ensure that the Allies win, and we can secure a homeland in Palestine. But not only were the Jewish people made a promise of a homeland in Palestine, we have to understand that at that time, Palestine was occupied by a very large Arab majority. We're talking about probably 90%. And there was always a little bit of, Jewish settlement, in Palestine, and of course Christian settlement, because as we know, Palestine has very great significance for the three major religions. So the Brits said to the Arabs, look, some of your lands are currently under the control of the Ottoman Turks. And you have to understand that the Ottoman Turks and the Arabs, they're all, religious-wise, they're all Muslims. Okay? But of course, Islam was brought to the world from the Arabian Peninsula. So of course, the Arabs would not want to play second fiddle to the Ottoman Turks, who currently, basically, it was the seat of the Islamic Empire. And especially the fact that the Arabs had, numerous empires themselves, different, as they would say, caliphates in the past. So it would have been uncomfortable, to play, again, second fiddle to the Ottoman Turks, especially, as we said, they'd be the ones having brought Islam to the world. But anyway, I think they also took the bait, so to speak, and decided that they were going to promote Arab nationalism. And the Brits decided, look, if you fight on the side of the Allies against the Ottoman Turks, guess what? When we win, or if we win, when we decide to dismantle the Ottoman Empire, you would be free of any tribute being paid to the Ottoman Turks, and you would gain your independence. You have to understand that the Arabs who were living in Syria, who were living in Iraq, who were living in Palestine, for them, that would have been a very attractive idea. Oh my God, wow, we're going to get independence if we fight on the side of the Allies. So I think it was a relatively easy sell. So at the time, the major leader in the Arabian Peninsula was Sharif Hussein, who could have traced his direct lineage to the Prophet Muhammad. And he decided that, yes, it made sense. Let's support the British. And he might have had misgivings, but let's just see how this turns out. I think the options, pretty much at that time, the better option was to support the Allies. We also had promises made to Russia of lands to be gained after the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire. Italy was made promises of lands also. So it was, it was a real, deal making before before the war ended, because of course the Allies wanted as much support as they can so they could defeat the Central Powers. But as is always the case, promises are made and promises are broken. When they're in need, they will promise you the world. But as soon as everything succeeds, there's no guarantee that people will keep their promises. So I want you to also keep that in mind in your personal life. So I think it's important for you to understand what the Ottoman Empire looked like. as you can see, much of it encompassed the whole of modern-day Turkey and some holdings along the Arabian Peninsula. Of course, they were in charge of the Levant, which we're talking about Israel and Lebanon and these places. They were in charge of Syria. They were in charge of Iraq, and to the west, you had Egypt, which was pretty much in control by the Brits, and you had Sudan, which was pretty much in control by the Brits. And of course, in the Persian Gulf, the Brits also had some holdings, in Yemen and to the southern part of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. So you can understand, based on the geography, why the Arabs would have wanted to support the British to fight against the Ottoman Empire. So I have another map that will help you to understand the genesis of this conflict. And it's very important to understand the geography of the area, and that's why I'm showing you these maps. They'll add a lot of clarity to your understanding of the genesis of this conflict. And also, I would, show you some maps with the demographics of the particular areas, especially Palestine. That would come shortly. But let's take a look at the British holdings in 1914 in that particular area. As you can see, as I said, the Brits were in charge of the Suez Canal. The Brits were in charge of Egypt, which is, basically, that's part of Egypt. And they were also heavily influenced in Sudan. If you look at the Ottoman Empire, they were in control of Syria. They were in control of most of the Levant. They were in control and the peripherals of Saudi Arabia. They were in control of Iraq. So they had a bit of holding around the Arabian Peninsula. All right, that's 1914. That's during World War One. Now let's look at what happens in 1922, roughly 4 years after the end of World War One. And of course, we know that the Allies ended up winning the war, and Russia had pretty much, because of the revolution that was taking place in the Bolshevik revolution that was taking place in Russia, they pretty much had withdrew in some respect from the conflict and got in a little, sort of spat with the Allies and exposed the plan of double dealing, of promises, which really embarrassed the British. But as I said, 1922 to the right, and you will see basically the Brits would have given independence to Egypt, but in the faded yellow areas, you would see control by the British, and Palestine is controlled by the British. You have Iraq being controlled by the British, and you have again in southern Arabian Peninsula, you have control by the British. So that's pretty much the land and the spoils of war. With the destruction of the Ottoman Empire, the lands were split up, and the French, of course, got Syria, which they always traditionally had some sort of connection with. Okay, so the Brits got what they wanted, the French got what they wanted, and everybody got a piece of the pie after the destruction of the Ottoman Empire. Now, of course, as you could imagine, everybody who was made a promise to once the cash in was over. So, of course, the Jewish people of Europe decided, hey, you know what, we supported you in the war. So they started to pretty much orchestrate all the things that would make it possible for them to have a state in Palestine. So slowly they started to migrate to Palestine. Slowly they started to organize the financial wherewithal to make it possible in terms of purchasing of land and all the things that would go with trying to set up a state. And you got to understand, the Brits are ruling Palestine now, right? So they're trying their best to set sort of limits on migration to Palestine from Jewish Europe, right? But of course, it's very difficult to control that. So as you could imagine, there is no place in the world where there are people living on land or existing people on a particular land, and then other people are trying to come and secure parts of that land. You can only imagine, as we've seen all over the world. So this conflict is not unique to Palestine. This is what happens all over the world. If there are people living in a patch of land, and other people are trying to come in and live on that patch of land, what you have, there will be resistance by the people living there, and of course, there will be some sort of offensive by the people who are trying to come there to live. Okay, especially with that level of migration, there will be some sort of resentment, and there will be sort of the beginnings of some sort of fight for the land. Remember, unfortunately, human beings can't live in the sky, so they have to live in land, and they will definitely fight to secure as much land as is possible. And the people who are living in the land will fight as much as is possible to resist from them securing that land. Well, that is exactly what happened. Okay, there's total chaos. There is fighting, and again, I don't even want to get. There's been so much carnage in the last week or so. I don't want to get too much into the carnage that took place, but I can tell you, and you can do your own research. It was horrible on both sides. So as I said, there's major fighting between the new arrivals and the people who are occupying Palestine or living, in Palestine. But what made the difference is that the new arrival had extensive support from Europe, and of course, they would have the material and financial resources to sort of effect the things that they were looking to effect. So, of course, there was constant skirmishes between the new arrival of Jewish people from Europe and, of course, the existing Arabs who were living in Palestine. Constant conflict. The Brits are caught in the middle. You got to understand that the Brits are just gone through a world war. They're exhausted, and they know that this is something that is not going to end well. They do not want to be caught in the middle. We've done our due. We've made our promises. In some respects, we have kept the promises. No, we cannot try to keep the peace because this situation is getting explosive. You're talking about militias on both sides. Like the current IDF emanated from what was called a Jewish militia that was called the Haganah at that time. And let's just give a little background of the major players in the Zionist movement. You had a guy called David Ben-Gurion, who was a Polish Jew, and he was a major, he was pretty much the leader of the Zionist movement at the time. And so here it is, he as the leader, he's orchestrating a lot of things which he perceives is necessary for the creation of a Jewish state. Some of it, again, as I said, I don't want to get too much into the carnage and the craziness, and you can only imagine what's going on from, let's say, the end of World War One to about 1947, when the UN tries to come in and sort of settle and create some sort of armistice and some sort of peace and try to settle the division of the land. Of course, by that time, the Brits are exhausted. They're like, look, we're getting out of here. They created a problem. It's an unsolvable problem now. It's gotten under control. There's terroristic actions on both sides, and horrific things are taking place. So the Brits are like, look, we need to get out of here. And that's pretty much what they did. Around 1947, I think it was finalized in like 48, they were going to leave Palestine. And whatever happened, happened. Okay? Major part of the land was led to the creation of Jordan, and the rest of it, the initial plan by the UN is, look, we're going to give 55% of the land for the creation of a state of Israel. Well, of course, you have to understand, after World War One, up to 1947, there's constant migration from Europe, and especially after World War Two. You understand? Because we know, the extent of persecution that the Jewish people would have faced in that period of time. So there was more of an incentive now for the creation of a Jewish state. Like, look, we definitely need to get out of Europe. We need to create our homeland where we can be around our own and we can have our own agenda and we can hopefully try to live in peace. Well, of course, as I said, that's not going to happen because there's people currently occupying the land, the Arabs, and nowhere in the world land is given freely. There's no handshake deal and say, oh, well, hey, you have a piece of the land, I'm going to leave, Nothing like that happens. So we know what's taking place. So as I said, the attempt by the United Nations really did not work out the way it was meant to work out. Because again, there's still constant fighting. Okay? Total constant fighting. So it seems that the only time that there was some sort of negotiation in that particular area, it was when there was some major conflict and the both sides are saying, you know what, let's sue for peace, let's try to, work this out. And we can think of some of the major events. For example, in 1967, you had the Six-Day War, where, the surrounding Arab countries pretty much, was at war with Israel. And that, of course, we know the history behind that. Israel won the war because there was an amazing, amazing, amazing operation, and the Arab nations were totally caught off guard. There was the Operation Focus by Israel, where they totally decimated the Arab Air Force. The Egyptians, the Syrians. The Air Force was totally decimated. So pretty much the war was over. Some may say after the 1967 Six-Day War that the nation of Israel got a little complacent and was a little bit drunk on the victory and sort of relaxed a bit. And this, of course, might have been the reason that in 1973, when you had the Arab-Israeli War, Israel didn't fend too well. Again, you had another surprise attack. The surprise came from the Egyptians, who crossed the Suez Canal and invaded. So again, that was a successful campaign by the Egyptians. But you have to understand, because of the Six-Day War, you have to understand again, the geography would have changed a bit in terms of the military geography would have changed a bit, because at that time Israel would have occupied the whole Sinai Desert, would have had got some holdings in the Golan Heights, which is on the border of Syria, and that in itself would continue to cause some conflict. But we're up to 73, where there was a successful campaign by the Egyptians, and again back to the negotiating table, and some sort of deal was worked out, and there was a relative peace and calm. But through that time, since 73, there was always flare-ups here, there, and everywhere. It's too much to mention. And of course, we have to understand what was happening subsequent to World War II. You had you had two major powers in the world competing for alliances again. You had, pretty much in the 80s, you had the Cold War. So everybody's trying to, decide, which side I'm on. Am I gonna be with the USSR? Am I gonna be with the United States? And everybody's jostling for position and jostling for power and jostling for allies. And that is where you see a lot of the Arab states finding an ally in the USSR. Okay, so another map of major interests are these four maps shown on the screen. And as we said, after the end of World War I, there was continued migration of Jews into Palestine. And of course, they, would have created settlements in Palestine. So if you look at the leftmost map, you would see the sort of demographics that existed in the land of Palestine around 1947, before the UN attempted to sort of broker some sort of settlement in terms of land space and statehood. So as you can see, there's a bit of settlement. If we move over, there was a partition plan, again, as we said, offered by the UN around 1947, when the Brits were about to exit Palestine. And we see Israel is shown, obviously, in the white, and the Palestinian lands are shown in green. Okay, and there was some sort of UN administrative zone in Jerusalem, because of course Jerusalem has significance for the three major religions, and it's a sort of international community. So we have to understand also that there is a religious dimension to all of this. So there's the religious, there's the socio-economic, and there's the political dimension. As I've said, every major empire that has crossed Palestine or has occupied Palestine at one time or the other, from the Assyrians to the Babylonians to the Achaemenid Empire, to the Caliphates, which was the Muslims, has found some way to try to pit the people that live there against each other, to try to influence what's going on politically and otherwise. So it's not surprising that the area is filled with so much contention, so much chaos, and so much enmity and bloodletting and stuff like that. So if you look at the partition plan of 1947, that's the second map. Okay, then to the third map, remember in 1948, around May 15th, that the British would have exited Palestine. So I look, I'm getting out of here. This shit is getting crazy. It's too much. It's too hot to handle. I'm tired of it. I'm exhausted from all this war. I'm heading home. So the British leaves. Well, you could imagine, as soon as the void is created, because the Brits was kind of tempering things. Of course, sometimes they would have sided with the Jewish settlers against the Arabs. And you have to understand the history that Europe has with the Jewish people. You have to understand the history that even Russia has with the Jewish people. So I would believe that support for Israel at that time from Europe and, let's say, from Russia would be some sort of attempt at redemption for the treatment of the Jews when they were living in those particular lands. And of course, I don't think occupation of Palestinian lands by Jewish immigrants would have been, or Jewish settlers would have been, something that the British or the Europeans would have shed much tear about. Again, considering the religious dimension, considering at one time the Muslims ruled Palestine during the times of the caliphates and stuff like that. And of course, considering the Crusades, when Christian Europe tried to release Jerusalem from Muslim rule. So that's a whole different dimension also. But all of these works to play some sort of role in the conflict. So let's look again. Let's get back to this 1949. Then the surrounding Arab nations, all in some way or the other, supported and descended on the fledgling Israeli state. You know what I'm saying? So the night before the exit was to happen. Remember we talked about David Ben Gurion. He decided with the Jewish Agency to declare the state of Israel, and that is the birth of the nation right there. And once that was declared, of course we understand you don't declare a state without having some sort of military force to pretty much protect that state. So we talk about the Haganah and how they transitioned into the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, So of course, once that a bit of power vacuum was created and the British are out, the newly created state of Israel and the remaining Palestinians are left to their own devices. And of course, because of the relations between the remaining Palestinians and the surrounding Arab states, they all attacked, right, to try to, secure as much land as possible. And, there was an ensuing battle. But of course, because of the level of organization and support that the new state of Israel had, of course, the Israeli state triumphed. And there was a bit of disorganization among the Arab states. There was not a unified command, but at least the Jewish agency and the Israeli state had a unified command, so that makes it easy in terms of when you're fighting a battle. So again, we can see what's happening in 1949 to 1967. You have more or expansion of the Jewish state. Again, there's no need to get into, the aspect of what would have happened, because it's obvious there is no land that is given up without a fight, and there is no land that is acquired without a fight. So you can only imagine the things that were taking place to change the demographics and change, the landscape, the political landscape of the land. If you go further to the right, currently we see what's going on. So again, as you can see, of course, there's a religious dimension, need for land, an expanding population, and we have to understand, we can be sentimental about it, we can be idealistic about it, but the reality of life on this planet Earth is that a lot of things are changed, especially when it comes to occupation of land and creation of nations. A lot of this involves extremely violent action. I always say, show me a nation in the world that was created by peaceful means. There's not one. I always liken the birth of a nation to the birth of a human. And I mean, one of the characteristics of the birth of a human is that human comes out violently and screaming. And I also, liken that to the birth of a nation. It's usually some violent action that takes place that creates a nation. There is not a nation I can think of on the earth that was created by peaceful means. So this is what we're seeing. As we can see, there's a lot of what you call settlements in the area that was designated as Palestinian area. As we're talking about the Gaza, and we're talking about the West Bank. The West Bank is the one to the right. The Gaza is that little piece of land that's just on the border of Egypt. And as you can see, a lot of what's going on in the West Bank, you can see the breaking up of what would have been Palestinian land. So it's the reason that we may find that this is so crazy and this is so violent and this is filled with carnage and brutality is because we're living through it and we are seeing it live. There's so much ability to document what's taking place. But I want you to understand that what is taking place there is pretty much not anything that's new. And again, if you were to look at the history of the place, there's so much. Just think about it. Even the original dispersion and driving out of the historical Jewish people from the area of Palestine was not a peaceful action. You see what I'm saying? So it's a very complicated issue, and anytime religion and external imperial powers, like for example, there's dynamics of external imperial powers trying to influence what's going on in modern day Palestine is not at all absent. Just like you had the Assyrians trying to influence what's going on, just like you had the caliphates, the Muslim caliphates trying to influence what's going on, just like you had the Achaemenid Empire trying to influence what's going on. Today you have powers that are trying to influence what is going on in modern day Israel and Palestinian territory. So to think that this is something that will be settled amicably is, I am very realistic about it. It's nearly impossible. And now with the present situation and with the violent uprising that has taken place in Israel, in southern Israel, this is something that does not help to add any peace to the area. And again, I can only imagine how this would unfold. It's a very, very inflammatory situation. It's a very unpredictable situation. I believe, based again on the fighting words of Israel and the fighting words of Hamas, that this would be some sort of all-out confrontation. It would be full-blown confrontation, and hopefully the rest of the region doesn't get entwined or enthralled into the conflict, because that will be unraveling and disastrous, and would of course force the United States to get involved. It would force many other parties to get involved. However, I believe that because of what's going on in Ukraine, that may in some respects temper the ambitions of the parties that are involved in the conflict in Israel and Palestine. Of course, we understand clearly the ambitions of Israel. We understand clearly the ambitions of the political leadership. But a ground offensive into Gaza depends on the momentum of that ground offensive, depends on the achievement of that ground offensive. That, in some respects, will determine where that conflict goes. Because I'm sure there are many nations looking along to see what's taking place. And we already see the level of destruction that's taking place in Gaza. But I firmly believe, I would hate to think that after the attack in southern Israel, that Hamas, in some respects, would not have anticipated a major retributive response by Israel. So, let's see what takes place and where this leads. But as it stands right now, as it's looking, it's a very dangerous situation. So let me know what you think. What are the prospects for peace? Where do you think this war is going to head? Because obviously Israel has declared war on Gaza. Do you believe the United States will be dragged into it? Do you believe the neighboring Arab nations may be dragged into it? Do you believe there might be some component of the Russians being, involved in this conflict in terms of being dragged into it? Do you believe that Israel may use the opportunity to not just deal with enemies in Gaza, but may extend their missions to neighboring states or enemies that they think that they feel they might want to deal with, and use that opportunity right now to get that done? It's a critical juncture in the events of Palestine and Israel. So a lot of the scenarios, I don't see it being a peaceable outcome. I believe that this is something that may continue for a while. So let's see how it unfolds. Please comment, tell me your thoughts, and give your input. Again, thank you for looking at Precision TV. We're here to give you logical, reasonable arguments and discussion, and there's no propaganda BS on Precision TV. Let's get the conversation going. Let's get the comments coming, and we can have some fruitful discussion that are intellectually honest. You have a good evening. Take care of yourself. Stay safe. Understand what's going on in the world, and truly decide if you really need to build your bunker. Have a great evening, guys. This is another one by Precision TV. Take care.